So our question is, why agriculture? Because there's nothing natural or inevitable about agriculture, mostly because cultivation of plants requires a lot more work than hunting and gathering, as you will see or have already seen in that John Green video. Um, Somewhere around 8000 BCE, many humans became increasingly dependent on cultivated crops and domesticated animals. By about 7000 BCE, we were supporting towns of up to about 1,000 people with agriculture. Um, by about 3500 BCE, the first what we call civilizations appeared in the Middle East, and nobody really knows why we made the shift from hunting and gathering to agriculture. There are a number of explanations that you can look up on the internet. There's the hilly flanks hypothesis, there's the oasis model, there's the feasting model. All of these have reasons to believe and many perhaps more reasons to disbelieve them. It seems that the favorite reason would be climate change. But the fact that farming was invented in many places around the globe suggests that there probably were some social reasons as well. The reality, though, is that we just don't know what happened because agriculture was developed before there were written records. Also recognize that this didn't happen instantaneously. We didn't go to sleep one night as hunter-gatherers and wake up the next morning as farmers. We probably had a long, few hundred year or more evolution where maybe hunter-gatherers recognized that the same crops, so to speak, grew in the same place. I mean, clearly they did. They were migratory people. They moved around, followed food sources, and after you'd lived for a little while, you would recognize that certain berries or certain grasses or certain other plants grew in the same places at the same time of year. It's not necessarily that much of a leap to understand that maybe you could help that process along by planting. So we probably had a combination of hunting and gathering and planting for some time. What that did, though, was improve the food supply, and then that dramatically increased the number of people that could be supported by that food. Because remember, it was taking about 1,000 calories of food or 1,000 calories of energy to produce 1,000 calories of food. Once there was agriculture and people could congregate in one place, we were able to create specialized jobs. In other words, people could make tools that would make it easier to do the agriculture, which in turn would produce more food, which in turn would produce the ability to feed more people. This brings up a point that we'll be talking about throughout the class, which is carrying capacity. And the carrying capacity we think of as carrying capacity of a system is how much a certain system can support on its own. There's an example of this in a piece of literature that I will post later in the class, and you'll see a little bit better what I'm talking about. But basically, what that means is we can think of perhaps the deer population. So when the deer population flourishes and there are no natural predators, the deer increase until they eat all of the available food. Once all of that food is eaten, the deer will start to die off because they won't be able to feed themselves any longer. And so the population will level out to what we think of as the carrying capacity for that particular piece of land or that particular area. So it's what the land can support naturally. We as humans have radically increased our carrying capacity with a variety of strategies, agriculture being one of them, irrigation as part of agriculture, and our increasing dependence, or our complete dependence really, on petrochemical fertilizers, and herbicides and insecticides. So we've increased the carrying capacity of the land far beyond what it really should be. One thing to think about when we're thinking about agriculture and its development around the globe is why traditionally we think of agriculture developing in what we call the cradle of civilization. That's generally the Middle East, what once was referred to as Persia. We now believe we call them Iran, Iraq, in that area. Um, and why, even though agriculture had developed in South America, in China, in many other places around the globe, why we really think of agriculture as developing in that fertile crescent of Mesopotamia along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Part of that is because a lot of Eurasia lies on an east-west axis, meaning that similar crops can grow along a certain region because our growing zones are predicated on mostly our distance from the equator. So, in terms of lines of latitude rather than lines of longitude. So, if we take a look at, say, Peru, where many potatoes first originated, you'll see that that country is along a north south axis. And so the growing zones are radically different as we go further down. Whereas in the Eurasian area, the Middle East, that spread out this way, and so that cultivated civilization was able to share information, share seeds, share growing techniques throughout the place this way rather than on a north-south axis. Another factor to consider in Mesopotamian agriculture is that Mesopotamia has many self-pollinating crops, six of them at least, exclusive to that area, that can reproduce without pollination from other plants. So why that's important is because that there are recessive traits that are vital to farming, but harmful to the plant in nature, and they don't get bred out of the plant through cross pollination. So, for example, along with the dominant trait for grains and pea pods to shatter in order to spread their seeds, it's a recessive trait for a few plants not to shatter. So that made it easier for people to harvest them, plant more of them next season, and spread the varieties with the normal harmful tendency not to shatter. So one major difference between hunting gathering societies and agricultural societies is that the hunting and gathering societies, since there's no private property, they tend to be more peaceful and more harmonious, and this is generally agreed to have been the case throughout that history. However, agricultural societies, individual families or individuals could farm their own land, leading to private property, which leads to social classes, which leads to greater conflict between rich and poor, to the point of, as John Green points out, slavery and increased warfare, things like that. Um, let's talk a little bit about domestication of animals. So, we've tamed and kept as pets many different kinds of animals, but for those to be useful enough as food sources, they had to meet a few criteria. One, they kind of had to be big enough, right? Maybe 100 pounds or more. But more importantly, they had to be herbivorous, so meaning they were plant eaters and fast growing, so that they didn't eat the same kind of food that we were trying to eat. Herbivores convert plants directly to meat. So cattle will eat grass, turn that into meat. Other animals do not do that. Secondly, if an animal's suitable for domestication, they need to live in herds or packs with a social order that we can say become the alpha of. And then thirdly is that animals have to be easy to tame and be willing to breed in captivity. So first of the animals to be domesticated were sheep and goats, probably around 9,000 BC, and they could live on rocky hillsides. They're herbivorous. They grow pretty quickly. They provided meat, milk, and fur. Pretty useful animals. Started selective breeding so that the fatter, meatier ones, right, became more of the flock, culling out the less desirables. Next up was the pig, probably somewhere around 7,000 BC. Now, unlike sheep and goats, Pigs aren't ruminants, meaning they don't eat grass, and we don't consume their milk. They don't have fur, but they do eat meat, and since they're scavengers, they have several advantages. So whether they're scavenging in the woods or in city streets, they're pretty cheap to keep. They also don't need a lot of supervision, unlike goats or sheep, which needed shepherds to tend to them. And then finally, until pretty recently, most towns and cities didn't have any kind of proper sanitation. So they were really clean and pretty gross. And believe it or not, pigs roaming the street actually kept the city cleaner than they would if pigs weren't around there, despite the fact that they would on occasion eat children or do other unruly kind of things. Um, Next up would be cattle, probably around 6500 BC, and they, like sheep and goats, gave milk, meat, hides. They also ate grass. They were also a lot bigger and wilder, not like the cattle that we know today, but they were a lot tougher and much more difficult to tame, to the point that some societies, like the Minoans in Crete, actually worship bulls as sources of power. Probably the most innovative use of the cow was to hitch it up to a plow so that we could use non human labor for the first time in tilling fields. However, the ancients had the bright idea to put the plow on the horns rather than around the neck, which we figured out much later on. A lot later, probably about 3,000 or so years later, the horse was domesticated, and there were three kind of far reaching effects that happened as a result of that. Most horse based societies didn't eat their horses, right? That happens on occasion, but it was not really the main reason for horses' domestication. But firstly, they could be used as a source of labor, just like cattle, although it wasn't until about 9000 AD that we discovered the horse collar and put that around kind of the neck and the chest that really maximized that potential. Secondly, mounted warfare made armies far more dangerous, mobile, very destructive, particularly the case of nomadic horsemen who would occasionally be the scourge of richer and more sedentary populations, so like the Mongols. And then finally, mounted messengers would dramatically quicken communication, so making it possible to maintain a very large empire. So, just as we now had various revolutions with the telegraph, the telephone, and now the internet in communications, you could think of horse messengers as sort of the internet of their time. The development of agriculture led to some things that we consider beneficial, besides an increased food supply. One, excuse me, is the science of mathematics. People started to study the movements of the moon and the suns and planets to calculate seasons. And in so doing, they created the first calendars. With a calendar, it's possible to calculate the arrival of the growing season. Measurement of land was necessary if property was going to be divided accurately. Measurements of amounts of, let's say, seeds or harvested grains. It's also a factor in farming and bookkeeping. And so then later would come measures of value of commodity and money exchange between cultures or between people of the same culture. Parts of the problems of agriculture that we hadn't discussed already would be once we concentrate people and animals into a smaller area, some things start to develop. So those of you who have school-age children might recognize that once school starts, colds and flus tends to spread through your child's class pretty rapidly because they're kids who are all together in a room for 6 hours a day and they're sharing germs, whether they're meaning to or not, and what they're exposed to, everybody gets exposed to. Same thing happened in our early cities, and certainly the same thing happened when we started to domesticate animals. Even now, we're concerned with viruses, for instance, becoming transgenic or across species. So we've had scares with the bird flu or with the swine flu. And those are called bird flu and swine flu because they originated with birds and with pigs. And because we keep animals in such intense confinement, those diseases can spread pretty rapidly through the animal population. Further, with agriculture, we tend to have irrigation, which means that we're bringing water to areas where there typically wasn't water previously. When we do that, we attract more insects. More insects often bring more disease. So, for instance, mosquitoes breed near standing water, and mosquitoes bring malaria. So, we've got benefits and we have things that are not so great about agriculture. And those things continue. Now, we have different problems these days. Most of us are not in this country worried about malaria from mosquitoes because we've made some other scientific advances to combat that. But as the course progresses, we're going to investigate what modern benefits and evils agriculture may have brought us.